Chapter 11 of Narrative of the Life of David Crockett of the State of Tennessee. Having returned from the legislature, I determined to make another move, and so I took my eldest son with me, and a young man by the name of Abram Henry, and cut out for the Obion. I selected a spot when I got there, where I determined to settle, and the nearest house to it was 7 miles, the next nearest was 15, and so on to 20. It was a complete wilderness, and full of Indians who were hunting. Game was plenty of almost every kind, which suited me exactly, as I was always fond of hunting. The house which was nearest me, and which, as I have already stated, was 7 miles off, and on the different side of the Obion River, belonged to a man by the name of Owens, and I started to go there. I had taken one horse along to pack our provision, and when I got to the water I hobbled him out to graze until I got back, as there was no boat to cross the river in, and it was so high that it had overflowed all the bottoms and low country near it. We now took to the water like so many beavers, notwithstanding it was mighty cold, and waded on. The water would sometimes be up to our necks, and at others not so deep, but I went of course before and carried a pole with which I would feel along before me, to see how deep it was, and to guard against falling into a slough, as there was many in our way. When I would come to one, I would take out my tomahawk and cut a small tree across it, and then go ahead again. Frequently my little son would have to swim, even where myself and the young man could wade. But we worked on till at last we got to the channel of the river, which made it about half a mile we had waded from where we took water. I saw a large tree that had fallen into the river from the other side, but it didn't reach across. One stood on the same bank where we were, that I thought I could fall so as to reach the other, and so at it we went with my tomahawk, cutting away till we got it down. And as good luck would have it, it fell right, and made us a way that we could pass. When we got over this, it was still a sea of water as far as our eyes could reach. We took into it again, and went ahead for about a mile, hardly ever seeing a single spot of land, and sometimes very deep. At last we come in sight of land, which was a very pleasing thing, and when we got out, we went but a little way before we came in sight of the house, which was more pleasing than ever, for we were wet all over and mighty cold. I felt mighty sorry when I would look at my little boy and see him shaking like he had the worst sort of an ague, for there was no time for fever then. As we got near to the house, we saw Mr. Owens and several men that were with him just starting away. They saw us and stopped, but looked much astonished until we got up to them, and I made myself known. The men who were with him were the owners of a boat which was the first that ever went that far up the Obion River, and some hands he had hired to carry it about 100 miles still further up by water, though it was only about 30 by land, as the river was very crooked. They all turned back to the house with me, where I found Mrs. Owens, a fine friendly old woman, and her kindness to my little boy did me 10 times as much good as anything she could have done for me if she had tried her best. The old gentleman set out his bottle to us, and I concluded that if a horn wasn't good then, there was no use for its invention. So I swigged off about a half pint, and the young man was by no means bashful in such a case. He took a strong pull at it too. I then gave my boy some, and in a little time we felt pretty well. We dried ourselves by the fire, and were asked to go on board of the boat that evening. I agreed to do so, but left my son with the old lady, and myself and my young man went to the boat with Mr. Owens and the others. The boat was loaded with whiskey, flour, sugar, coffee, salt, castings, and other articles suitable for the country, and they were to receive $500 to land the boat at McLemore's Bluff, beside the profit they could make on their load. This was merely to show that boats could get up to that point. We stayed all night with them, and had a high night of it, as I took steam enough to drive out all the coal that was in me, and about 3 times as much more. In the morning we concluded to go on with the boat to where a great hurricane had crossed the river and blowed all the timber down into it. When we got there, we found the river was falling fast and concluded we couldn't get through the timber without more rise. So we dropped down opposite Mr. Owen's again, where they determined to wait for more water. The next day it rained rip-roariously, and the river rose pretty considerable, but not enough yet. And so I got the boatsmen all to go out with me to where I was going to settle, and we slapped up a cabin in little or no time. I got from the boat 4 barrels of meal, and 1 of salt, and about 10 gallons of whiskey. To pay for these, I agreed to go with the boat up the river to their landing place. I also got a large middling of bacon, and killed a fine deer, and left them for my young man and my little boy, who were to stay at my cabin till I got back, which I expected would be in 6 or 7 days. We cut out and moved up to the hurricane, where we'd stopped for the night. In the morning I started about daylight, intending to kill a deer, as I had no thought they would get the boat through the timber that day. I had gone but a little way before I killed a fine buck, and started to go back to the boat. But on the way I came on the track of a large gang of elks, and so I took after them. I had followed them only a little distance when I saw them, and directly after I saw 2 large bucks. I shot one down, and the other one wouldn't leave, so I loaded my gun and I shot him down too. I hung them up and went ahead again after my elks. I pursued on till after the middle of the day before I saw them again, but they took the hint before I got in shooting distance and run off. I still pushed on till late in the evening, when I found I was about 4 miles from where I had left the boat, and as hungry as a wolf, for I hadn't eaten a bite that day. I started down the edge of the river low grounds, giving out the pursuit of my elks, and hadn't gone hardly any distance at all before I saw 2 more bucks, very large fellows too. I took a blizzard at one of them, and up he tumbled. The other ran off a few jumps and stopped, and stood there till I loaded again and fired at him. I knocked his trotters from under him, and then I hung them both up. I pushed on again, and about sunset I saw 3 other bucks. I downed with one of them, and the other 2 ran off. I hung this one up also, having now killed 6 that day. I then pushed on till I got to the hurricane, and at the lower edge of it, about where I expected the boat was. Here I hollered as hard as I could roar, but could get no answer. I fired off my gun, and the men on the boat fired one too, but quite contrary to my expectation, they had got through the timber, and were about 2 miles above me. It was now dark, and I had to crawl through the fallen timber the best way I could, and if the reader don't know it was bad enough, I am sure I do. For the vines and briars had grown all through it, and so thick that a good fat coon couldn't much more than get along. I got through at last, and went on near to where I had killed my last deer, and once more fired off my gun, which was again answered from the boat, which was still a little above me. I moved on as fast as I could, but soon came to water, and, not knowing how deep it was, I halted, and hollered till they came to me with a skiff. I now got to the boat without further difficulty, but the briars had worked on me at such a rate that I felt like I wanted sewing up all over. I took a pretty stiff horn, which made me feel much better, but I was so tired that I could hardly work my jaws to eat. In the morning, myself and a young man started and brought in the first buck I had killed, and after breakfast we went and brought in the last one. The boat then started, but we again went and got the 2 I had killed just as I turned down the river in the evening, and we then pushed on and overtook the boat, leaving the other 2 hanging in the woods, as we now had as much as we wanted. We got up the river very well, but quite slowly, and we landed on the 11th day at the place the load was to be delivered at. They here gave me their skiff, and myself and a young man by the name of Flavius Harris, who had determined to go and live with me, cut out down the river for my cabin, which we reached safely enough. We turned in and cleared a field, and planted our corn, but it was so late in the spring we had no time to make rails, and therefore we put no fence around our field. There was no stock, however, nor anything else to disturb our corn, except the wild varmints, and the old serpent himself with a fence to help him couldn't keep them out. I made corn enough to do me, and during that spring I killed 10 bears, and a great abundance of deer. But in all this time we saw the face of no white person in that country, except Mr. Owen's family and a very few passengers who went out there looking at the country. Indians, though, were still plenty enough. Having laid by my crop, I went home, which was a distance of about 150 miles. And when I got there, I was met by an order to attend a call session of our legislature. I attended it and served out my time, and then returned and took my family and what little plunder I had, and moved to where I had built my cabin and made my crop. I gathered my corn, and then set out for my fall's hunt. This was in the last of October, 1822. I found bear very plenty, and indeed all sorts of game and wild varmints, except buffalo. There was none of them. I hunted on till Christmas, having supplied my family very well all along with wild meat, at which time my powder gave out, and I had none either to fire Christmas guns, which is very common in that country, or to hunt with. I had a brother-in-law who had now moved out and settled about 6 miles west of me, on the opposite side of Rutherford's Fork of the Obion River, and he had brought me a keg of powder, but I had never gotten it home. There had just been another of Noah's freshes, and the low grounds were flooded all over with water. I knowed the stream was at least a mile wide, which I would have to cross, as the water was from hill to hill, and yet I determined to go on over in some way or other, so as to get my powder. I told this to my wife, and she immediately opposed it with all her might. I still insisted, telling her we had no powder for Christmas, and worse than all, we were out of meat. She said we had as well starve as for me to freeze to death or to get drowned, and one or the other was certain if I attempted to go. But I didn't believe the half of this, and so I took my woolen wrappers and a pair of moccasins and put them on, and tied up some dry clothes and a pair of shoes and stockings, and started. But I didn't before know how much anybody could suffer and not die. This, and some of my other experiments in water, learned me something about it, and I therefore relate them. The snow was about 4 inches deep when I started, and when I got to the water, which was only about 1/4 of a mile off, it looked like an ocean. I put in, and waded on till I come to the channel, where I crossed that on a high log. I then took water again, having my gun and all my hunting tools along, and waded till I came to a deep slough that was wider than the river itself. I had crossed it often on a log, but behold, when I got there, no log was to be seen. I knowed of an island in this slough, and a sapling stood on it close to the side of that log, which was now entirely under water. I knowed further that the water was about 8 or 10 feet deep under the log, and I judged it to be about 3 feet deep over it. After studying a little what I should do, I determined to cut a forked sapling which stood near me, so as to lodge it against the one that stood on the island, in which I succeeded very well. I then cut me a pole, and crawled along on my sapling till I got to the one it was lodged against, which was about 6 feet above the water. I then felt about with my pole till I found the log, which was just about as deep under the water as I had judged. I then crawled back and got my gun, which I had left at the stump of the sapling I had cut, and again made my way to the place of lodgment, and then climbed down the other sapling so as to get on the log. I then felt my way along with my feet, in the water about waist deep, but it was a mighty ticklish business. However, I got over, and by this time I had very little feeling in my feet and legs, as I had been all the time in the water, except what time I was crossing the high log over the river and climbing my lodged sapling. I went but a short distance before I came to another slough, over which there was a log, but it was floating on the water. I thought I could walk it, and so I mounted on it, but when I had got about the middle of the deep water, somehow or somehow else it turned over, and in I went up to my head. I waded out of this deep water and went ahead till I came to the high land, where I stopped to pull off my wet clothes and put on the others, which I had held up with my gun above the water when I fell in. I got them on, but my flesh had no feeling in it, I was so cold. I tied up the wet ones and hung them on a bush. I now thought I would run so as to warm myself a little, but I couldn't raise a trot for some time. Indeed, I couldn't step more than half the length of my foot. After a while I got better, and went on 5 miles to the house of my brother-in-law, having not even smelt fire from the time I started. I got there late in the evening, and he was much astonished at seeing me at such a time. I stayed all night, and the next morning was most piercing cold, and so they persuaded me not to go home that day. I agreed, and turned out and killed him 2 deer. But the weather still got worse and colder instead of better. I stayed that night, and in the morning they still insisted I couldn't get home. I knowed the water would be frozen over, but not hard enough to bear me, and so I agreed to stay that day. I went out hunting again, and pursued a big he-bear all day, but didn't kill him. The next morning was bitter cold, but I knowed my family was without meat, and I determined to get home to them, or die a-trying. I took my keg of powder and all my hunting tools and cut out. When I got to the water, it was a sheet of ice as far as I could see. I put on to it, but hadn't got far before it broke through with me, and so I took out my tomahawk and broke my way along before me for a considerable distance. At last I got to where the ice would bear me for a short distance, and I mounted on it and went ahead. But it soon broke in again, and I had to wade on till I came to my floating log. I found it so tight this time that I knowed it couldn't give me another fall, as it was frozen in with the ice. I crossed over it without much difficulty, and walked along till I got to my lodged sapling and my log under the water. The swiftness of the current prevented the water from freezing over it, and so I had to wade, just as I did when I crossed it before. When I got to my sapling, I left my gun and climbed out with my powder keg first, and then went back and got my gun. By this time I was nearly frozen to death, but I saw all along before me where the ice had been fresh broke, and I thought it must be a bear straggling about in the water. I therefore fresh primed my gun, and cold as I was determined to make war on him if we met. But I followed the trail till it led me home, and I then found it had been made by my young man that lived with me, who had been sent by my distressed wife to see, if he could, what had become of me, for they all believed that I was dead. When I got home I wasn't quite dead, but mighty nigh it, but I had my powder, and that was what I went for. End of chapter 11.